The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty compound in Afghanistan as Maria Santos wiped the sweat from her forehead. At 28, she had never imagined her culinary training from a small cooking school in Texas would lead her to this remote military outpost, preparing meals for Navy SEALs and other special operations forces. The kitchen tent was her domain, filled with the aroma of freshly baked bread and the sizzle of eggs on the griddle. Maria had joined the civilian contractor program 6 months earlier, driven by a combination of adventure and the need to pay off her student loans. Her mother had been horrified when she announced her plans to cook for the military in a war zone. But Maria had always been stubborn and independent. She saw it as an opportunity to serve her country while doing what she loved most, feeding people. The base, known as Forward Operating Base Lightning, was situated in a valley surrounded by rugged mountains. It housed approximately 200 personnel, including an elite SEAL team that had arrived 3 weeks ago for a classified mission. Maria had quickly earned their respect with her ability to turn military rations into something resembling home-cooked meals. The SEALs, initially skeptical of the young civilian cook, had grown fond of her warm personality and exceptional cooking skills. Lieutenant Commander Jake Morrison, the SEAL team leader, often joked that Maria's breakfast burritos were worth their weight in gold. She had a way of making even the most hardened warriors smile with her stories from back home and her infectious laughter. Despite the dangerous environment, Maria maintained an optimistic outlook that brightened the mood of everyone around her. But Maria harbored a secret that none of her military friends knew about. Before culinary school, she had spent 2 years in the Army National Guard, where she had discovered an unusual talent. During a routine training exercise, her shooting instructor had noticed something extraordinary about her marksmanship abilities. With minimal training, Maria could hit targets at distances that challenged even experienced marksmen. Her natural eye-hand coordination, combined with an almost supernatural ability to control her breathing and heartbeat, made her a phenomenal shot. She had participated in several marksmanship competitions, winning medals and recognition. However, when her National Guard unit was never deployed, Maria decided to pursue her passion for cooking instead, viewing her military training as just a chapter in her past. The secret weighed on her sometimes, especially when she watched the SEALs preparing for their dangerous missions. She understood weapons, tactics, and military operations better than any civilian cook should, but she kept this knowledge to herself. Her role was to feed the troops, not to fight alongside them. On this particular morning, as Maria prepared breakfast for the early shift, she noticed increased activity around the base. Helicopters had been coming and going throughout the night, and there was a tension in the air that she had learned to recognize. Something big was happening, though as a civilian contractor, she wasn't privy to operational details. Sergeant First Class Michael Chun, one of the SEALs who had become a friend, stopped by the kitchen tent for his usual cup of coffee. His normally jovial demeanor seemed strained, and dark circles under his eyes suggested he hadn't slept. "Rough night?" Maria asked, handing him a steaming mug. Chun forced a smile. "You could say that. Thanks for this." He gestured to the coffee. "Listen, Maria, we might be going dark for a while. The team's got a mission that could keep us out for several days." Maria nodded, understanding the implications. When the SEALs went dark, it meant radio silence and no communication with the base. It usually indicated a high-risk operation behind enemy lines. "I'll keep some of those protein bars you like in reserve," she said. "And I'll make sure there's hot food waiting when you get back." "You're an angel," Chun replied, his smile becoming more genuine. "The guys really appreciate everything you do." As Chun left the kitchen tent, Maria couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled in her stomach. She had developed a sixth sense about these things during her time at the base, and something felt different about this mission. Throughout the morning, she watched as the SEAL team conducted their final preparations. They moved with the practiced efficiency of elite warriors, checking weapons, reviewing maps, and conducting last-minute briefings. Lieutenant Commander Morrison caught her eye from across the compound and gave her a small wave, which she returned with what she hoped was an encouraging smile. By noon, the SEALs had departed in their Black Hawk helicopters, disappearing into the mountainous terrain that surrounded the base. The compound felt strangely empty without their presence. and Maria found herself checking the horizon more frequently than usual. The rest of the day passed quietly, with Maria focusing on her duties and trying to push away the nagging worry in the back of her mind. She prepared lunch for the remaining personnel, cleaned the kitchen thoroughly, and began planning the next day's meals. Cooking had always been her way of dealing with stress, and she threw herself into preparing an elaborate dinner that would boost morale among the troops left behind. As evening approached, Maria was in her quarters, a small tent adjacent to the kitchen, when the first explosion shattered the peaceful silence. The ground shook violently, and she was thrown from her cot onto the floor. Emergency sirens began wailing immediately, their piercing sound cutting through the night air. Training from her National Guard days kicked in automatically. Maria rolled under her cot, protecting herself from any debris that might fall from the tent ceiling. Her heart pounded as she listened to the sounds of chaos erupting outside, shouting voices, running footsteps, and the distinctive crack of rifle fire. A second explosion, closer this time, sent a shockwave through the tent that made her ears ring. Through the canvas walls, she could see the orange glow of fires that had started somewhere in the compound. The acrid smell of smoke and something else, something chemical, began to seep into her tent. Maria's military training warred with her civilian status. Every instinct told her to grab her gear and join the defense, but she was a cook, not a soldier. She wasn't even supposed to be armed, though she knew where the emergency weapons cache was located. Outside her tent, she could hear Sergeant Williams, the base security chief, shouting orders to his men. Contact front. Multiple hostiles approaching from the north ridge. Get those mortars suppressed. The sound of incoming mortar rounds whistled overhead, followed by more explosions that seemed to be walking closer to her position. Maria realized that staying in her tent was becoming more dangerous than venturing outside. She grabbed her helmet and flak jacket, standard issue for all personnel, and prepared to make a dash for the nearest bunker. As she emerged from her tent, the scene that greeted her was like something from a nightmare. The vehicle maintenance building was engulfed in flames, casting dancing shadows across the compound. Tracer rounds streaked through the darkness like deadly fireflies, and the thunder of heavy machine gun fire echoed off the surrounding mountains. Maria spotted a group of soldiers taking cover behind concrete barriers near the communications building. She sprinted toward them, keeping low as bullets whined overhead. The distance that normally took 30 seconds to walk seemed to stretch endlessly as she dodged debris and tried to avoid the worst of the crossfire. She dove behind the barriers just as another mortar round exploded where she had been standing moments before. The soldiers, recognizing her as the cook, made room for her in their defensive position. "Maria, what are you doing out here?" shouted Corporal Davis, a young medic she had served countless meals to over the past months. "My tent was getting too hot," she replied, trying to inject some humor into the terrifying situation. "What's the situation?" "Taliban fighters, maybe 30 or 40 of them, attacking from multiple directions," Davis explained, pausing to fire several rounds at muzzle flashes on the ridge. "They hit us with mortars first, trying to take out our communications and vehicles. Now they're moving in for the compound." The defensive position consisted of 8 soldiers, including Davis, but Maria quickly realized they were severely outgunned. The attackers had the advantage of higher ground and appeared to be well armed with automatic weapons and rocket-propelled grenades. "Where's Sergeant Williams?" Maria asked. "Coordinating the defense from the command bunker," Davis replied. "He's trying to get air support, but the nearest helicopters are 20 minutes out. 20 minutes might as well be 20 hours in their current situation." Maria could see that the defensive perimeter was already being compromised in several places. Taliban fighters were using the cover of darkness and smoke to advance closer to the main buildings. As she watched the battle unfold, Maria's military training began to assert itself more strongly. She found herself analyzing the enemy's tactics, identifying their likely approach routes, and calculating fields of fire. Her civilian cook persona was rapidly being replaced by the soldier she had once been. A series of explosions erupted near the mess hall, and Maria felt a pang of personal loss as she watched flames begin to consume the building where she had spent countless hours preparing meals for the troops. But there were more immediate concerns as Taliban fighters appeared to be massing for a direct assault on their position. "They're coming," shouted one of the soldiers, pointing toward shadows moving between the buildings. The defensive position erupted in gunfire as the soldiers engaged the approaching enemy fighters. Muzzle flashes lit up the night as both sides exchanged intense fire. Maria pressed herself against the concrete barrier, feeling completely helpless as the battle raged around her. It was in that moment, as she watched young soldiers fighting desperately to defend their base, that Maria made a decision that would change everything. Her days of hiding her true abilities were over. These men needed every advantage they could get, and she possessed skills that could make a difference. The question was whether she was ready to transform from the cook they all knew and loved into something else entirely, something that might help them all survive the night. As another wave of enemy fighters prepared to assault their position, Maria Santos began her mental preparation for a transformation that would shock everyone who thought they knew her. The scared cook was about to disappear, replaced by someone far more dangerous than anyone could have imagined. The intensity of the firefight continued to escalate as Maria crouched behind the concrete barriers with the 8 soldiers. Taliban muzzle flashes lit up the darkness like deadly stars, and the constant crack of incoming rounds made conversation nearly impossible. She watched as Corporal Davis, barely 21 years old, returned fire with methodical precision despite the obvious fear in his eyes. Private Johnson, positioned to her left, suddenly cried out and grabbed his shoulder. Blood seeped between his fingers as he slumped against the barrier. Davis immediately moved to tend to the wounded soldier, but this left a gap in their defensive line that the enemy quickly noticed. "We need to relocate," shouted Sergeant Martinez, the senior non-commissioned officer in their group. "They're flanking us from the east side." Maria could see he was right. Taliban fighters were using the burning vehicles as cover to advance along their right flank. In minutes, they would be completely surrounded with no avenue of escape. The nearest fallback position was the armory, approximately 50 yards away across open ground that was now swept by enemy fire. "I'll provide covering fire while you move the wounded," Maria said suddenly, surprising everyone, including herself. "Maria, you're a civilian," Martinez replied firmly. "Your job is to stay down and stay alive." "Give me a rifle," she insisted, her voice carrying an authority that none of the soldiers had heard from her before. "I know how to use it." Martinez hesitated, looking at the blood on Johnson's uniform and then at the advancing enemy fighters. The situation was desperate enough that conventional rules were becoming irrelevant. "Can you really shoot?" he asked. Instead of answering with words, Maria pointed toward a Taliban fighter who had just emerged from behind a damaged Humvee about 100 yards away. "The one with the rocket launcher, behind the burned truck. He's about to target the communications building." Martinez followed her gaze and saw exactly what she was describing. The enemy fighter was indeed preparing to fire an RPG at one of their critical installations. "Davis, give her your backup weapon," Martinez ordered. Davis handed Maria his secondary rifle, an M4 carbine, along with 2 spare magazines. The moment the weapon touched her hands, something fundamental shifted in her demeanor. The nervous energy that had characterized her movements disappeared, replaced by the calm confidence of a trained marksman. Maria checked the weapon with practiced efficiency, ensuring it was properly loaded and the safety was off. She then assumed a shooting position that immediately impressed the soldiers around her. Her breathing slowed to a controlled rhythm, and her body seemed to become perfectly still despite the chaos surrounding them. The Taliban fighter with the RPG had completed his preparations and was raising the weapon to his shoulder. Maria's crosshairs found him through the rifle scope, and she made the minute adjustments necessary to account for distance, wind, and the target's movement. Her shot rang out just as the enemy fighter was about to pull the trigger. The bullet struck him center mass, and he collapsed backward, the unfired RPG falling harmlessly to the ground. The precision and timing of the shot left the soldiers staring at her in amazement. "Holy shit," whispered Private Collins. "Where did you learn to shoot like that?" "Later," Maria replied tersely, already acquiring her next target. "Right now, we need to move." She provided methodical covering fire as Martinez and Davis helped the wounded Johnson toward the armory. Her shots were precise and economical, each one carefully aimed to maximum effect. She never wasted ammunition, and Every round seemed to find its mark or force enemy fighters to seek better cover. As they reached the armory, Maria noticed something that made her blood run cold. Through the smoke and flame, she could see Taliban fighters moving toward the medical building where several wounded soldiers from earlier in the attack were being treated. The building was lightly defended, and the patients inside were essentially helpless. "They're going for the medical facility," she told Martinez. "There's nothing we can do about that right now," he replied grimly. "We barely have enough people to defend this position." Maria studied the tactical situation with the analytical mind of a trained soldier rather than a cook. The medical building was approximately 200 yards away, across terrain that was partially covered by smoke and debris. There was a water tower between their position and the building that could provide concealment for most of the approach. More importantly, there was a maintenance ladder on the back side of the water tower that led to a platform about 30 feet above ground level. From that elevated position, she would have clear fields of fire to the medical building and the surrounding area. "I'm going to that water tower," Maria announced, pointing to the structure. "That's suicide," Martinez protested. "You'll be completely exposed." "Not if I'm fast enough," she replied, checking her remaining ammunition. "And, from up there, I can provide overwatch for the medical building and support your position here." Without waiting for permission, Maria sprinted from the armory toward the water tower. She moved with surprising speed and agility, using available cover to mask her movement from enemy observers. Several Taliban fighters spotted her and opened fire, but she was already diving behind a concrete drainage pipe as their bullets sparked off the ground where she had been. The run to the water tower took less than 30 seconds, but it felt like an eternity as bullets whined overhead and impacted the ground around her feet. She reached the base of the structure and immediately began climbing the maintenance ladder, her rifle slung across her back. Halfway up the ladder, an enemy fighter appeared around the corner of a nearby building and spotted her climbing. He raised his weapon to fire just as Maria, hanging by one hand, drew her sidearm with the other and put 2 quick shots center mass into his chest. The fighter dropped immediately, and she continued her ascent. From the platform at the top of the water tower, Maria had a commanding view of the entire compound. She could see the full scope of the Taliban attack, which was larger and more coordinated than anyone had realized. Enemy fighters were advancing on multiple fronts, and the base's defenders were being stretched to their breaking point. She also had a clear line of sight to the medical building, where she could see Taliban fighters preparing to breach the main entrance. Inside that building were at least 6 wounded soldiers, including 2 who were in critical condition and unable to be moved. Maria assumed a prone position on the platform and began engaging the enemy fighters approaching the medical facility. Her first shot dropped the lead attacker at a distance of nearly 300 yards. Her second shot eliminated the fighter carrying what appeared to be explosives, probably intended to blow open the medical building's reinforced door. The precision of her shooting began to have a psychological effect on the enemy fighters. They had expected to face typical base security forces, not a sniper who could pick them off with surgical accuracy from an elevated position. Several Taliban fighters began seeking more substantial cover, slowing their advance. From her vantage point, Maria could also provide support to the other defensive positions around the base. She spotted a group of enemy fighters preparing to assault the communications bunker and methodically eliminated the 3 most dangerous targets. Her shooting was so accurate that the remaining attackers abandoned their assault and retreated to regroup. But Maria knew that her elevated position was both an advantage and a vulnerability. The Taliban fighters would eventually figure out where the precise shooting was coming from, and the water tower platform would become a target for their mortars and RPGs. As if reading her thoughts, she saw an enemy fighter setting up a mortar tube approximately 400 yards away, clearly intending to target her position. The range was at the limit of her rifle's effective accuracy, especially in the dark with limited visibility, but Maria had made more difficult shots during her competitive shooting days. She controlled her breathing, accounted for the slight crosswind, and gently squeezed the trigger. The shot seemed to hang in the air forever before finding its target. The mortar operator collapsed over his weapon, and the immediate threat to her position was eliminated. For the next 20 minutes, Maria continued to provide overwatch and precision fire support to the base's defenders. She had become a force multiplier, allowing the outnumbered soldiers to hold positions they otherwise would have been forced to abandon. Her ammunition was running low when she spotted something that made her heart skip a beat. Through her rifle scope, she could see a large group of Taliban fighters massing for what appeared to be a final coordinated assault on the main command bunker. If they succeeded in taking that position, the entire base would fall. Worse yet, she recognized some of the weapons they were carrying. Several fighters had American-made equipment, including what appeared to be night vision devices and advanced communication gear. This wasn't a random attack by local insurgents. It was a well-planned operation by a sophisticated enemy force. Maria began picking off the most dangerous targets in the assault group, but there were too many of them for her to stop alone. She needed to do something dramatic to disrupt their attack, something that would buy time for help to arrive. That's when she spotted the fuel truck parked near the motor pool, directly in the path of the enemy's planned assault. If she could ignite that truck at the right moment, the explosion would scatter the attacking fighters and possibly eliminate several of them. The problem was the distance and the small target she would need to hit. The fuel tank's cap was barely visible at over 300 yards, and she would need to hit it with enough force to puncture the tank and create sparks that would ignite the fuel. Maria had one armor-piercing round left in her magazine, a special bullet designed to penetrate light armor and create sparks on impact. If she could hit the fuel tank at exactly the right angle, she might be able to create the explosion she needed. She waited until the Taliban fighters were in the optimal position, clustered together as they prepared for their final assault. Then, she took careful aim at the fuel tank cap, controlled her breathing one final time, and fired her last armor-piercing round. The bullet struck the fuel tank and punched through the metal, creating a shower of sparks that immediately ignited the diesel fuel inside. The explosion was massive, lighting up the entire compound and creating a fireball that could be seen for miles. The blast wave knocked several enemy fighters to the ground and scattered the rest of the assault group. More importantly, the light from the explosion revealed the positions of Taliban fighters throughout the compound, allowing the base's defenders to engage them more effectively. As Maria watched the chaos that followed the explosion, she heard the distant sound of helicopters approaching. Air support was finally arriving, and she knew the tide of battle was about to turn in their favor. But her sniper work wasn't finished yet. There were still enemy fighters in the compound, and wounded soldiers who needed protection until medical evacuation could arrive. The explosion of the fuel truck created a mushroom cloud of orange flame that illuminated the entire compound like daylight. The massive blast had disrupted the Taliban's final assault, but Maria could see through her scope that numerous enemy fighters were still active throughout the base. The sound of approaching helicopters grew louder, but she estimated they were still several minutes away. From her elevated position on the water tower, Maria had a clear view of the entire battlefield. The explosion had revealed the positions of at least a dozen Taliban fighters who had been using the darkness as cover. Some were regrouping for another assault, while others appeared to be trying to extract valuable equipment or prisoners before the helicopters arrived. Her immediate concern was a group of 3 enemy fighters who were moving toward the medical building, apparently undeterred by the explosion. They carried what appeared to be explosive charges, and Maria realized they intended to destroy the building and everyone inside rather than capture it. She had already used her last armor-piercing round on the fuel truck, leaving her with only standard ammunition. The distance to the medical building was nearly 400 yards, at the extreme range of accurate shooting with her current weapon. But the lives of the wounded soldiers inside gave her no choice but to attempt the shots. Maria's first shot dropped the lead fighter as he approached the medical building's entrance. The second fighter immediately sought cover behind a concrete barrier, but Maria had anticipated his movement and placed her shot perfectly as he dove for safety. The third fighter, realizing he was being targeted by a sniper, abandoned his mission and retreated toward the perimeter fence. As she scanned for additional targets, Maria noticed movement near the communications bunker. Several Taliban fighters were attempting to plant explosive charges on the building that housed the base's satellite communication equipment. If they succeeded in destroying that facility, the base would be cut off from outside support indefinitely. The fighters had positioned themselves in a location that was partially concealed from ground-level defenders, but clearly visible from Maria's elevated position. She began engaging them methodically, forcing them to abandon their demolition mission and seek cover. Her shooting had become so precise that word was spreading among the enemy fighters. She could see them pointing toward the water tower and gesturing animatedly. It wouldn't be long before they organized a concentrated effort to eliminate her position. That effort came sooner than expected. A Taliban fighter armed with a rocket-propelled grenade launcher took position behind the ruins of the vehicle maintenance building and aimed directly at the water tower. Maria spotted him through her scope just as he was preparing to fire. The range was over 300 yards, a difficult shot for the RPG operator, but well within the lethal radius if he hit the water tower platform. Maria had perhaps 3 seconds before he would pull the trigger. She took quick aim and fired, striking the fighter in the shoulder just as he launched his rocket. The impact of her bullet caused him to jerk sideways, sending the RPG off target. Instead of hitting the water tower, the rocket struck the ground about 50 yards away, creating a harmless explosion that showered dirt and debris but caused no damage to Maria's position. The near miss reminded Maria that her position, while tactically advantageous, was becoming increasingly dangerous as the enemy focused their attention on eliminating her. She needed to relocate before they brought more heavy weapons to bear on the water tower. But first, she noticed something that made her blood run cold. Through her scope, she could see Taliban fighters herding a group of captured base personnel toward the perimeter fence. Among the prisoners, she recognized Sergeant Williams, the base security chief, and 2 other soldiers she couldn't immediately identify. The enemy fighters appeared to be preparing to execute the prisoners or use them as human shields. Either way, Maria couldn't allow that to happen. The problem was that the prisoners were surrounded by at least 6 armed Taliban fighters, making any rescue attempt extremely dangerous. Maria studied the tactical situation carefully. The prisoner group was approximately 200 yards from her position, near the base's main gate. The area was relatively open, with limited cover for either the prisoners or their captors. If she could eliminate the guards quickly enough, the prisoners might have a chance to reach safety. She would need to make 6 precise shots in rapid succession, a feat that would challenge even the most experienced snipers. Miss any of the targets, and the remaining guards would likely execute the prisoners immediately. The margin for error was essentially 0. Maria checked her ammunition and found she had 8 rounds remaining in her current magazine, plus 1 full magazine in reserve. She would need to make every shot count, as there would be no opportunity for a second attempt. She took several deep breaths to calm her nerves and began acquiring her targets. The guards were positioned in a rough circle around the prisoners, with 2 of them facing outward as lookouts while the others focused on their captives. Maria decided to eliminate the lookouts first, as they were most likely to spot any rescue attempt. Her first shot dropped the leftmost lookout before he even realized he was being targeted. Her second shot eliminated the guard on the right side of the group. The remaining 4 fighters immediately began looking around in confusion, trying to determine where the shots were coming from. Maria's third shot struck the apparent leader of the group, a tall fighter who was shouting orders to the others. Her fourth shot dropped another guard who was raising his weapon toward the prisoners. 2 guards remained, and both were now using the prisoners as human shields. This was the moment Maria had dreaded. The remaining guards were positioned so that any shot at them risked hitting the prisoners they were hiding behind. She needed a different approach. Through her scope, she could see Sergeant Williams making subtle hand gestures to his fellow prisoners. Despite being captured, he was still trying to coordinate some kind of action. Maria realized he was preparing for the prisoners to create a distraction that would give her clear shots at the remaining guards. The prisoners suddenly scattered in different directions, with Williams tackling one of the guards to the ground. This gave Maria the clear shots she needed. Her 5th round eliminated the guard who was grappling with Williams, while her 6th shot dropped the final captor who was trying to flee toward the perimeter. The entire engagement had lasted less than 30 seconds, but it felt like hours to Maria. She watched through her scope as the liberated prisoners ran toward the communications bunker, where they would be safe with the other defenders. The sound of helicopters was now much closer, and Maria could see the lights of at least 2 aircraft approaching from the south. Air support was finally arriving, but she knew the battle wasn't over yet. Taliban fighters throughout the compound were likely preparing for a final push before the helicopters arrived with reinforcements. As if confirming her thoughts, she spotted a large group of enemy fighters massing near the motor pool for what appeared to be one last attempt to take the command bunker. They had learned from their earlier failed assault and were now approaching from a different direction, using the smoke from various fires as concealment. Maria realized that her current position on the water tower no longer provided an optimal angle to engage this new threat. She would need to relocate again, but the approaching helicopters might mistake her for an enemy fighter if she moved around the compound with a rifle. She made a quick decision to remain in position and do whatever damage she could to the final enemy assault. If she could eliminate enough of their leadership or disrupt their coordination, the arriving air support would be able to finish the job. Through her scope, she identified what appeared to be the assault leader, a fighter carrying a radio and issuing orders to the others. She took careful aim and fired, watching as the leader collapsed, and the assault group momentarily hesitated in confusion. Maria continued to pick off key targets in the assault group, focusing on fighters who carried heavy weapons or appeared to be in leadership roles. Her shooting was having a significant impact on enemy morale and organization. Several Taliban fighters began retreating toward the perimeter fence rather than participating in the assault. The first helicopter, an Apache attack helicopter, arrived over the compound just as the remaining enemy fighters reached the command bunker. The helicopter's 30mm cannon opened fire with devastating effect, forcing the Taliban fighters to seek whatever cover they could find. Maria watched in satisfaction as the tide of battle finally turned decisively in favor of the base defenders. The Apache was soon joined by a second attack helicopter and a Black Hawk carrying reinforcements. The remaining Taliban fighters, realizing their situation was hopeless, began retreating en masse toward the surrounding mountains. As the immediate threat diminished, Maria finally allowed herself to relax slightly. Her rifle barrel was hot from sustained firing, and her arms ached from maintaining shooting positions for over an hour. But the adrenaline of combat was still coursing through her veins, keeping her alert and ready for action. She could see base personnel emerging from their defensive positions as the helicopters established security around the compound. Medics were running toward the medical building to check on the wounded, while other soldiers began the process of clearing the area and accounting for all personnel. Maria knew that she would need to climb down from the water tower soon, but she wanted to maintain overwatch until she was certain all enemy fighters had been eliminated or driven off. Through her scope, she continued to scan the compound and surrounding area for any signs of remaining threats. It was during this final scan that she spotted something that made her freeze with alarm. In the distance, beyond the perimeter fence, she could see a Taliban fighter with what appeared to be a long-range rifle taking position on a rocky outcrop. He was clearly preparing to target personnel in the compound, possibly the pilots of the newly arrived helicopters. The range was extreme, well over 500 yards, but Maria could see through her scope that the enemy sniper was methodically setting up for a precision shot. If he succeeded in killing one of the helicopter pilots or other key personnel, he could still inflict significant damage despite the overall defeat of the attack. Maria realized she was probably the only person in the compound who had spotted this distant threat. The enemy sniper was well concealed from ground-level observers and was positioned beyond the effective range of most of the weapons available to the base defenders. She had one magazine of ammunition remaining, and this would likely be her most challenging shot of the entire battle. The distance, the darkness, and the enemy's partial concealment all worked against her. But she couldn't allow this final threat to go unchallenged. Maria took careful aim at the distant enemy sniper, accounting for the extreme range and estimating the bullet drop and wind drift. She controlled her breathing, steadied her rifle, and prepared to take what might be the most important shot of her life. The distant Taliban sniper was positioned on a rocky outcrop approximately 550 yards from Maria's position on the water tower. Through her scope, she could see him making final adjustments to his rifle scope, preparing for what would likely be a devastating shot at one of the helicopter pilots or ground personnel. The extreme range pushed Maria's weapon and ammunition to their absolute limits. At this distance, bullet drop would be significant, and Even a slight crosswind could send her shot wide of the target. She had no laser rangefinder, no weather data, and no spotting scope to help her calculate the perfect shot. She would have to rely entirely on her natural instincts and years of competitive shooting experience. Maria studied the target carefully through her scope, noting the sniper's position relative to the surrounding rocks and vegetation. She observed the movement of smoke from the various fires in the compound, using it to estimate wind direction and speed. Every detail would matter for a shot at this distance. She could see that the enemy sniper was almost ready to fire. His rifle was shouldered, and he appeared to be tracking a target in the compound, probably one of the helicopter pilots who was visible near his aircraft. Maria estimated she had perhaps 10 seconds before he would take his shot. Taking a deep breath, Maria made her final calculations. She aimed several feet above and to the left of the target, accounting for bullet drop and wind drift. Her heart rate slowed to the controlled rhythm she had learned during her competitive shooting days. Everything around her seemed to fade away except for the crosshairs in her scope and the distant target. Maria's shot rang out across the compound just as the enemy sniper was squeezing his trigger. Through her scope, she watched as her bullet struck the Taliban fighter's center mass, causing him to jerk backward and sending his own shot harmlessly into the sky. The distant threat was finally eliminated. The successful long-range shot marked the end of the battle for forward operating base Lightning. Taliban fighters who had been hiding in the surrounding area began retreating into the mountains, realizing that their attack had failed completely. The helicopters continued their patrols around the compound, but no additional enemy contact was made. Maria finally allowed herself to relax as she realized the immediate danger had passed. She safed her weapon and began the careful descent from the water tower platform. Her legs were shaky from adrenaline and fatigue, and she had to grip the ladder rungs tightly to avoid falling. When she reached the ground, Maria found herself surrounded by a group of soldiers who had been watching her descent. Word of the mysterious sniper who had been providing precision fire support throughout the battle had spread quickly through the defending forces. Sergeant Martinez, who had been with her during the initial defensive action, approached with a look of amazement on his face. "Maria, what the hell was that up there? Where did you learn to shoot like that?" Before she could answer, Lieutenant Colonel Harrison, the base commander, arrived with several other officers. Harrison was a veteran of multiple combat deployments and had seen his share of heroic actions, but the reports he had been receiving about the civilian cook's performance during the battle were almost unbelievable. "Ms. Santos," Harrison said formally, "I've been getting reports about your actions tonight that I'm having trouble believing. My men tell me you single-handedly held off multiple enemy assaults and eliminated threats at ranges that would challenge our best designated marksmen." Maria suddenly felt self-conscious standing there in her cook's uniform, holding a military rifle that she technically wasn't supposed to have. The transformation from civilian contractor to combat sniper felt surreal now that the immediate danger had passed. "I just did what needed to be done, sir," she replied simply. "What needed to be done?" Harrison repeated incredulously. "You eliminated over 20 enemy fighters, disrupted their assault plans, rescued captured personnel, and probably saved this entire base. I need to know where you learned these skills." Maria took a deep breath and began explaining her background in the Army National Guard, her competitive shooting experience, and the training that had given her the skills she had demonstrated that night. As she spoke, more soldiers gathered around to listen, including many whose lives she had likely saved with her actions. "Why didn't you tell anyone about your military background?" asked Sergeant Williams, who had been among the prisoners she had rescued. "I wasn't hired to be a soldier," Maria replied. "I was hired to cook. I thought my military days were behind me." The irony of the situation wasn't lost on anyone present. The base had been defended by elite soldiers, sophisticated weapons systems, and extensive defensive preparations. But the decisive factor in their survival had been a cook who happened to be one of the most skilled marksmen any of them had ever witnessed. Over the next hour, as the base personnel conducted casualty assessments and damage surveys, the full scope of Maria's contribution became clear. Security camera footage and eyewitness accounts confirmed that she had eliminated at least 25 enemy fighters during the battle. More importantly, her precision shooting had prevented the Taliban from achieving any of their primary objectives. The medical building, communications facility, and command bunker had all been saved from destruction by her intervention. The prisoners she had rescued included key personnel whose loss would have been devastating to base operations. Her disruption of the final enemy assault had given the arriving helicopters a tactical advantage that made the Taliban's defeat inevitable. Lieutenant Commander Morrison and his SEAL team returned to the base the following morning, having successfully completed their classified mission behind enemy lines. When Morrison learned about the battle and Maria's role in defending the base, his reaction was typical of the special operations community. "You're telling me that our cook held off an entire Taliban assault force by herself?" Morrison asked Harrison during their mission debriefing. "That's exactly what I'm telling you," Harrison replied. "Your cook is apparently one of the most skilled snipers I've ever encountered. She made shots last night that I wouldn't have believed possible if I hadn't seen the results myself." Morrison immediately sought out Maria, who was back in the temporary kitchen tent, preparing breakfast for the base personnel despite having had no sleep. She looked up as the SEAL team leader approached, flour on her hands, and a tired but satisfied expression on her face. "Maria," Morrison said, shaking his head in amazement, "I don't know what to say. The guys are telling me you turned into some kind of superhero while we were gone." "Just did my job," Maria replied with a modest smile. "Your job was to cook for us, not to save all our lives," Morrison pointed out. "Well, I figured if I let you all get killed, I'd be out of work," Maria joked, causing Morrison and several nearby soldiers to laugh. The story of Maria's transformation from cook to combat hero spread throughout the military community with remarkable speed. Within days, she was receiving commendations from senior officers throughout the theater of operations. Her actions at Forward Operating Base Lightning became a case study in individual heroism and the importance of hidden talents. The SEALs, in particular, were deeply impressed by her performance. These elite warriors, accustomed to working with the most skilled marksmen in the military, recognized that Maria possessed abilities that were truly exceptional. Her combination of natural talent, competitive experience, and mental toughness under extreme pressure marked her as someone special. "We've worked with Army snipers, Marine Scout snipers, and special operations marksmen from around the world," Sergeant Chun told her one day. "But none of them could have done what you did that night. The angles, the distances, the pressure situations, it was phenomenal shooting." Maria's story also attracted attention from military recruiters and special operations units who were interested in her unique skill set. However, she surprised everyone by announcing her intention to complete her contract as a civilian cook before considering any military opportunities. "I came here to feed people," she explained to Morrison. "And that's what I'm going to keep doing until my contract is finished. You guys need good meals just as much as you need good shooting." The Taliban attack on Forward Operating Base Lightning had been intended as a major propaganda victory that would demonstrate their ability to strike American forces even in heavily defended positions. Instead, it became a story of American resilience and the unexpected heroism of ordinary people in extraordinary circumstances. Maria Santos returned to her duties as a cook, but everything had changed. The soldiers no longer saw her as just the friendly civilian who made great breakfast burritos. They saw her as someone who had risked her life to protect theirs, someone who had demonstrated courage and skill under the most extreme circumstances imaginable. The respect and gratitude of the troops was evident in every interaction. Soldiers who had previously chatted casually with her now approached with a combination of familiarity and reverence. She had earned her place among warriors in a way that no training or assignment could have achieved. More importantly, Maria had discovered something about herself that she had never fully understood before. Her years of competitive shooting and military training hadn't just been hobbies or temporary assignments. They had prepared her for a moment when lives would depend on her unique skills. The young woman who had joined the civilian contractor program to pay off student loans and see the world had become something much more significant. She had become a symbol of the potential that exists within ordinary people when circumstances demand extraordinary action. The last entry in the official after-action report for the defense of Forward Operating Base Lightning included a simple but powerful statement from Lieutenant Colonel Harrison. "The survival of this installation and the lives of its personnel are directly attributable to the exceptional courage and skill of civilian contractor Maria Santos. Her transformation from cook to combat marksman under extreme pressure represents the finest traditions of American service members in defense of their fellow warriors. For the SEALs who witnessed her actions that night, Maria would always be remembered as the cook who became a sniper when her friends needed her most. As Morrison told his team after the battle, "We'll never forget this." Years later, when Maria had returned to civilian life and opened her own restaurant, she would still receive letters and visits from the soldiers whose lives she had saved that night in Afghanistan. The bonds forged in combat never fade, and the gratitude of warriors saved by unexpected heroism lasts a lifetime. The story of how she went from cook to sniper in seconds had become part of military legend. But, for Maria, it was simply the night she discovered what she was truly capable of when people she cared about needed her most.